It's time to transform together, and we want to start this together with this summit here, a pre-summit towards the next summit. My question now is a rather concrete one. We have seen huge numbers here. In order to do that, we will need disruptive innovation, as we have heard several times, not reform, but transforming or even disrupting education system. So my simply sounding question is, looking at education today, in order to transform it, are there a few things that you say we should keep as is and focus just on one or two things, really change them, disrupt them? So what is it that we could discard and do differently with the help of the private sector? And what is it where the private sector cannot or should not actually, contribute? And the question goes to Tina first.
Thank you, Simon. And you asked everybody about the disruption. I mean, if I had to say one disruption that could help transform education is to change mindsets. It's not the easiest thing, but I think it's really important, because when you change your mindset, you change everything that you do to improve yourself. And when you mentioned, Simon, what are the things that I wouldn't change? I wouldn't change the education system in such a drastic way where it doesn't still promote the importance of literacy skills. That's still very vital. I wouldn't change the importance of language. That's really important, because that's to do with how we communicate with one another. Of course, the foundational skills and numeracy skills are really important, especially now that the STEM field is getting more and more prominent. A few things that I would suggest, and I would ask delegations here to have an open mind, because it's not a criticism of how the ministries of education are working, but these are the real concerns and observations that the private sector, our members, have observed at the national level. They would say things like, the curriculum doesn't promote students on asking the question why. It's always the what, the how, the when, the which, but not really asking why. Why are we learning this? Why are we, it's asking those right questions. A lot of the classrooms, it's more of a passive instruction. The teacher stands and then you have students, and it's really passive. It's not really an active two-way engagement where it promotes critical thinking, entrepreneurial skills, which Tara was talking about, which is really, really important. When there is a problem, the way that it's set up is that there's only one solution, but in real life, it's more than that. In real life, there's more complexity. You need to collaborate with one another, and that's only being taught later on, like at university. Presentation skills, you only learn that in university in some countries, and that's not really helpful. It needs to start at a younger age, and that's very much linked to the learning crisis, which the World Bank was talking about. In low-income countries, students, when they finish primary school, they can't even understand a simple story. So that's really, really a problem. How can we talk about lifelong learning when we can't even provide access to basic education in many countries? So that's something that we really, really want to highlight. And this notion of overcrowding, I mean, there are a lot of schools that are overcrowded. I can understand because of the population density in certain areas, but I think there's also an important role there where the private sector, private schools can also provide some complementary support where there are gaps, and that would provide more choices for parents as well to choose from. That could be really helpful. And a lot of the schools that we see promote more memorization and repetition rather than a full understanding of what you're learning at school. So these kind of skills like critical thinking, creativity, learning to learn, all these entrepreneurial skills, leadership, all these kind of skills we only learn later in life. But I think there should be more projects within the classroom that could promote, this kind of thing at a much earlier age. I stop.
Thank you, Tina. And the microphone goes to Taha. Your education experience is sort of the closest in terms of time. So if you were to change one thing in that education experience that you have made, with the private sector lens, of course, right? What would it be if you just do the magic?
I think it was alluded, it was talked about earlier. We live in a world where industries are created and destroyed over the span of years. The way we learn is changing. So the way I learned 2 years ago is different to how I learn today, post-pandemic and the rest. The only constant seems to be change. So being able to be agile in the way we design our education and iterate based on feedback from the learners themselves is critical. And being able to use learners themselves to create content is essential if we're to achieve scale. So that's one of the things we do. We run programs at very large scale, leveraging user-generated content. So that means young people who look similar to the people we are instructing. So if you're in a concrete example, you're in Burundi, let's have a young person from Burundi speak about the importance of data science, et cetera, rather than it being built out of, no matter how great they are, a certain university thousands of miles away. So really leveraging young people to be part of the solution, both in terms of the feedback, but also in terms of the curriculum.
Thanks, and I believe that's what some of your members are doing, Ashti, so tell us about it.
That's right. I'm really going to touch on 3 areas where I think the non-state education sector can help transform education in a positive way. And the first one was touched on, which is really leveraging the innovation that resides within the non-state sector or the private sector. We know that there is a huge amount of innovation coming from the private or the non-state sector in schools. In fact, analysis by the Brookings Institution finds that about 85% of innovations in the education sector are coming from the non-state or the private sector. So how can we really leverage that? And how can we leverage the agility that the non-state or the private sector has and use it really as a test bed for innovation? So I think over the last couple of days, we heard about teaching at the right level, and we heard about structured pedagogy. So those kinds of innovations, let's use the non-state sector to test them, to build the evidence around what works, and then work hand in hand with governments to think about how they can be scaled up across wider education systems. The second piece that I want to touch on is the idea of really building and scaling partnerships between governments and the private or the non-state sector. I started by saying that we really do need a all-hands-on-deck approach, and the private sector can work alongside governments with a relentless focus on improving learning outcomes and developing new partnerships at scale between governments and the non-state sector, making use of the capabilities, the skills, and the additional financing that the non-state sector can bring. And we should do that and build these partnerships in an equitable way so that children from the most marginalized backgrounds are able to access quality education. And on that note around partnerships, build from learning, what works. So we have examples, for example, in Pakistan from the Punjab Education Foundation and the Sindh Education Foundation, where they worked to bring non-state actors to support the state government to roll out quality education for children. And my final point is around really harnessing household expenditure, which was an important point made by Her Excellency, the Minister of Education from Malawi yesterday in the session on financing. So we know that household expenditure makes up 37% of total education expenditure in low-income countries and 31% in middle-income countries. We all in this room collectively want to see a major increase in public education financing from both domestic and international sources. But until and unless we see that increase, household finance will continue to be a major source of funding. Parents are spending money. So how can we leverage that and harness that in a more equitable way? So using, for example, cash transfers so that the options available to the poorest children are the same as those available to the rest of the population. So these are kind of 3 key areas that I think we can bring.
Thank you, Ashti. And the microphone goes to Tara. And the question actually is, you know how it works, right? You have done it in 150 countries. How can you bring the approach that you have developed into schools? How can we scale it up in a way that it works, even beyond your own control?
Yeah, I think I think two things, we have so much evidence on what works. I think project-based learning, there's just tremendous amount of evidence that shows that's what gets students engaged. And I think we would add to that where give students a chance to help figure out their identity and their sense of purpose, because that will put them on a path of lifelong learning, because you have to keep addressing and building that sense of purpose. The second thing we have found that is very, very strong is the impact of mentorship. And every year we recruit roughly 6,000 industry mentors across the world. And it is powerful even for the mentors themselves, because it is a chance for them to give back to the community, build your own sense of purpose. And together, the student and the mentor working really builds a very strong and scalable model, because there are industry partners all over the world. There are young people all over the world looking to make an impact. So I would keep these two elements that we know works well, and through COVID we know that virtual mentoring worked very well. It actually worked even better than a lot of corporations expected it to. I'll share one story. There's a Technovation girl, Nora, in Mexico. She was really upset about the high rates of domestic violence. She and her teammates made an app to help young children know that what are the levels of domestic violence that are normal and not. And she was a very, very shy individual. She had an Oracle mentor from industry partner. And over time, the mentor kept giving her opportunities, gave her an internship, and now she's a full stack software engineer working on a very powerful app to make public data from the Mexican government known to young people so that young people can be more civically engaged. And now she's a mentor for other incoming Technovation girls, and an incredibly powerful, confident young woman. So we have so many stories of mentorship working really well and giving students purpose. The thing that I would change is, in addition to what everybody has said, is there's a lot of conversation around open access to online curriculum. But one recommendation is, like, whenever we put any kind of content online, think about your own experience. Like, how often do we register for an online course, and how often do we not finish it? But we finish it when we have a mentor or a peer or a friend who will do it with us. And so every time we release any kind of online content, I would encourage you to think about who is the human that's going to provide support to that young person who's going to use that content. And that's something that I think would be very helpful going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. We hear the combination of the human component and the technological component is the way forward. It's not the one or the other, and which of course is a perfect segue to William. The word educational technology floats around everywhere, right? I mean, some people see it as the panacea for the learning crisis. Some people actually see it as one of the main causes of the learning crisis. So perhaps if you could spend a few minutes, from your experience, from an education technology perspective, what is it that we can really expect from educational technology in the years to come towards achieving SDG 4?
That's a big question, and I'm not a futurologist, but I'll try to comment. But before I do so, I think it's important to recognize that everyone's perception or everyone's context of transforming education is different. You heard it in the presentations we just watched. The priorities from country to country are quite different. I'll start from maybe the negative side. What is it that I would discard? I'm afraid to say I might discard everything if I could, right? The entire teaching model as we know it today is fundamentally broken and flawed, which might be a controversial thing to say. But we can't do that. We have to make systemic change, and I think we have to introduce changes over time. They can be accelerated from time to time, as we just witnessed during the pandemic. But I think I would start there. Speaking of technology, yes, technology can play a role in all of this. It can play a role in introducing project-based learning and giving the students, or giving the teachers, I should say, tools so that they can be more productive and have the time to switch their role to become more facilitators rather than instructors, for example. This technology already exists. That's not the future, that's the present, right? I would say the future might be in technologies that actually deliver on this personalized learning experience that we've all been chasing for a couple of decades at least. But I think it's becoming real now. So there's now very real potential to actually apply artificial intelligence technology. It might sound scary, but imagine a scenario where you're a student, maybe in a classroom of 30 kids, and you're trying to learn algebra, and there's one teacher, and you get stuck on a problem. Or maybe you're even intimidated and afraid to ask the teacher for help. So you fall behind and you lack the confidence, and the more you fall behind, the more you fall behind, right? So it's a never-ending cycle, and probably many of us in this room have experienced it firsthand, either yourselves or your children. But what if there was a technology that could actually detect where it is that you're getting stuck? And this technology exists today, so we can now actually analyze videos and text, actually look at a student's performance on a particular problem and recognize where the student is having difficulty and recommend some resources for that student to be able to self-remediate instead of having to ask the teacher to help. So it sounds a little bit scary, it sounds a little futuristic, but it's actually real, and it's happening. And the technology exists to do this on any subject. So, and it impacts all these different modalities of learning that we've just been hearing about. I think there's great promise in this, but of course, we have to do it mindfully, taking into perspective that everybody's context is different, as I said. And we also have to do it in a way that the support is available within the system to help people implement these new technologies. But I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to start to see some very transformative technologies come into market very soon.
Thank you, William. And we do have a few more minutes, so let me bring the microphone back to Ashti. Is that a realistical prospect in the Global South?
I'd like to say yes, and hopefully with private sector partners like yourself, William, we can make that a reality. But at the moment, when we speak to our members, located in the Global South, and in particular over the last couple of years with the many challenges faced by COVID, communities were really struggling to even access, use mobile technology to provide, lessons and insights to children. So I think we do have a long way to go, but I think, with the people in this room, hopefully, we can work to really transform that. But as I said, I think we have to really think about equity being at the heart of this conversation and making sure that no children are left behind as we think about the future.
Surely.
I'll just share something. So pre-COVID, we were running an AI family program and a competition encouraging younger children to work with their parents. And we decided to work primarily in very low-income communities. And we were absolutely surprised to have a group, a refugee camp in Somalia, raise their hand to say, we would like to run this 10-week AI program. And we were so surprised, but they said every week 180 children and parents would come to learn about how they could use AI to tackle problems in their communities. And the number one thing the parents said was that we have AI facial recognition in our phones. Nobody ever bothered to tell us how it works, and never have we been asked how we can contribute to these technologies. And so AI as a word, as a technology, is far more known than we think. And I think sometimes we tend to be very condescending, where we say basic literacy first, whereas many people have smartphones. And it's incredibly empowering. I've known mothers who have very low literacy. They came to these programs for their children, but then they walked away saying, I just built a mobile app, right, and can do facial recognition. And the agency that they have has so much impact long term.